recording. So tonight we are going to discuss the question of kosher wine, and Maxine, I'm gonna mute you, Maxine, because I'm not sure why. Okay, so we're discussing kosher wine, and I always remember, initially thinking, well, what in wine would not be kosher? It's made from grapes. You can't have grapes that are not kosher, and so, but we'll see. There's a lot going on here, and it's actually, well, I think it's interesting, but that may not be a good judge because I'm interested in almost everything related to Jews and Judaism. So, and this is actually from I think it's called Wine 101, and I think the website actually is a wine cellar, a kosher wine cellar, and a cellar, SELLER. They're probably also cellar with a C, but they have a stake in promoting the sale of kosher wine. So I always like to do this, getting into it. So what do you think makes wine kosher or not kosher before we start reading the article? Cheryl.
Well, what happens if non-Jews touch it?
Yes, so that, and we're going to get into the details of what touching it means, and this article helped me understand that a little bit. But you will hear a lot. The article begins by saying something like, does a rabbi have to bless the wine to make it kosher? Bryce.
I think it's halachic supervision of the process of making the wine to ensure its purity.
Yes, and purity from a variety of things, which we'll see. So
yeah,
I would say
that's what I'm talking about.
Yes.
Not just physical purity. Anybody can do that.
Yeah, and I guess a key point, which you are absolutely correct on, is halachic supervision, which is even for milk or things that you wouldn't think could possibly be unkosher, to earn the stamp. And I think there's the order of 20 or so different authorities that certify the kashrut of something. It has to be under supervision. My older brother was in the baking business, and it was Arnold bread, which out here is Oro wheat, but if you're from the East, you'll remember, or some of you are in the East may know Arnold bread. And I think he was involved with some company that was making matzah for Passover, and the supervision and the steps they had to go through was very substantial. So that's actually a very good point.
If I could just add, I watched a video of matzah being made by the Strites Matzah Company, and they had a process where all the workers, immigrants, other non-Jews, are part of the process up to one stage, after which the people after that had to be Jewish.
Oh, that's interesting.
To Cheryl's point, or somebody's point about, did they have to be Jewish to do the wine? In the matzah factory, whether it was halakha required, the company had a process where they made sure the last parts were done by somebody Jewish.
Yeah, and I'm not familiar with the logic behind that. Erwin.
I would like to ask you, is the law applies to grapes as the other fruit, that you cannot pick it for so many years, like oranges?
Yeah, so generally speaking, and I'm, again, I certainly am not an expert on kashrut or halacha, but you can't use the fruit. Hold on one second. You can't use the fruit of, I think, almost anything that grows, probably trees though, for the first 3 years. And yes. I'm sure that I know that applies to trees. I assume it applies to grapes. I really don't know. So that's why I am not a mashgiach, someone who can certify the kashrut. Okay, so let's take a look at the article. And I presume we can see it okay. Okay, so by Dr. Kenneth Friedman. So would someone like to read What is Kosher Wine?
I'll read if no one wants it.
Thank you. Thank you, Joanne.
All right. What is kosher wine? Wine and Judaism are inextricably linked. Throughout history, wine has and continues to be at the center of ritual Jewish life. Considered a beverage that carries special significance and with its own blessing both before and after consumption, wine is involved in many of the important Jewish events on our calendars. 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, in many of the important Jewish, years ago, wine accompanied the sacrificial offerings in the temple in Jerusalem. The Passover Seder relegates a central role to the 4 cups of wine, symbolizing our freedom from slavery and the Jewish Exodus. Each Shabbat and holiday meal begins with the saying of Kiddush over a cup of wine. Jewish marriage features wine under the chuppah and with the 7 blessings, concluding the wedding. The list is quite extensive.
Yeah, I'll just comment. One of the interesting things about the laws of blessings is if you're having bread with a meal, you say the motzi. I think most of you know what I'm talking about. And that covers any food you might eat during the meal, except for wine. So for example, grapes, since they grow in a bush and not a tree, if you're just having some grapes as a snack, you would say Bare Peri Ha'adama. If you were peeling an orange and going to have an orange, you would say Bare Peri Ha'etz. And you know, even water gets its own. Even water and everything else gets its own. Stephen, you were going to ask a question.
First of all, I think you're wrong. I think grapes are ha'etz, not ha'tama.
Grapes may be Bare Peri Hagafen. Actually, I'm not sure about
that. No, hagafen is only on a liquid.
Okay, so yes,
I think hagafen is grape juice or wine, and that solid grapes are ha'etz.
I believe, well, the example I always talk about is bananas are Bare Peri Ha'adama, because the rabbis rule that a banana tree is not a tree, it's a bush because it doesn't have branches. Now, so I would have to check because clearly a grapevine has branches. But believe me, I don't spend a lot of time worrying about this. But the interesting point that I wanted to make is that if you have a challah or bread, or any kind of bread, before a meal, you say, hamotzi lechem min haaretz, and it covers your eating every other food. You don't have to say any other blessings over food, except for wine. Wine gets its own blessing, and that was really
it covers everything you're eating as your sustenance or as your entrees and side dishes, but it doesn't cover the dessert that you're eating just for pleasure.
Again, the details of the halacha are not something I think about a lot or at all. Okay.
So, can I say something?
Sure.
If you want to bless the food, all the food, you say bread, the name is not.
Yeah.
So this way will cover everything.
No, actually, if you say hamotzi lechem min haaretz, that covers everything. Mezonot covers food that are made from grains that are not bread. It would not cover water. It would not cover chocolate. It wouldn't cover whiskey. It wouldn't cover meat of any kind. That list is shehakol nihiyeh bidvaro. So it's Baruch atah Adonai, blessed are you Adonai, shehakol nihiyeh bidvaro, whose word caused everything to be. That I'm sure of. Alan.
I watched a movie a long time ago, and these Jews in this kitchen, they made a point of talking about the blessing over the meat, flesha, or something, and so that it's not necessary over the meat. So it was a meat meal, and they said a blessing for the meat, and not just the
So if they said a motzi, they don't have to say a separate blessing over meat.
Okay, and dairy would be a similar.
Yeah. A motzi covers everything, but if you say a motzi, then you have to say a full birkat hamazon. A full birkat hamazon takes, 5 or 10 minutes at the end of the meal. If you don't say a motzi, if you say mezonot, for example, then there's a much abbreviated version of the birkat. So next time you fly and select a kosher meal. I'm not sure if you would know this in English, or it might just be in Hebrew. A lot of times they will have something that looks like bread, and they will have Hebrew saying mezonot, that it's not bread. Because if it's bread, then you say a motzi, and then you got to get a minyan together to say the Birkat Hamazon. So
you better fly El Al then in that case.
yes. If you fly El
Does
Al,
does gluten have any relevance? You know, food that's gluten free, is that at all relevant to?
I only that and I'm not sure about this, but it may well be that food that is gluten free doesn't have one of the 5 grains that make bread for motzi.
Well, except that there's now now gluten-free oat.
Yeah, so yeah, this is beyond my understanding. So
Thank you.
Let's read on.
Ask your Chabad rabbi. Okay, so let's Joanne, you want to continue? There is nothing about.
Sure. There is nothing about the laws of creating a kosher bottle of wine that would differentiate the quality of the final product from a non-kosher one. Many fallacies abound regarding kosher wine, but the simple fact is that kosher wine can be every bit as good or bad as a non-kosher wine. Kosher indicates nothing about the quality or lack thereof in a wine. It is simply a certification that the wine within the bottle has been supervised as a kosher production. We are blessed to live in an era where we are easily able to taste world-class kosher wines from many of the globe's top wine regions.
And it's probably worth mentioning, I'm sure many of you know this, but the Hebrew word kosher doesn't only refer to food. It means fit or appropriate. So for example, a Torah scroll in a synagogue is kosher if it meets Jewish law. Your mezuzah scroll is kosher or not kosher. So the word kosher is used quite a bit. In fact, when someone goes to a mikvah, particularly for conversion, and you need witnesses, one of the things that the witness will say, making sure the person gets completely under the water, and it's usually an issue if someone has long hair and the hair is floating on top. The hair actually has to get completely under the water, and the witness then will say kosher for the validity of the immersion.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is about some uses for wine. And this is Ani Ladodi Vadodi Li, on my beloveds, and my beloved is mine. You see this on many ketubot. So actually, there are 2 cups of wine at a traditional Jewish wedding, one in the betrothal part, the ring part of the wedding, and then the second one is the first of the 7 blessings. Okay, so go ahead.
So what makes wine kosher? You've likely heard the urban legend that a rabbi must bless wine to confer a kosher status upon it. Well, you've heard wrong. In short, for wine to be considered kosher, the entire winemaking process, from crushing to bottling, must be handled by Sabbath-observant Jews and no non-kosher findings or additives may be included.
So it's interesting. I'll just point out, we're not saying just Jews, but Sabbath observant Jews. So that's an important element here.
But nothing in Jewish law is ever so simple. So let's go into greater detail.
Truer words were never spoken.
Right. Traditionally, wine holds a position of great importance in Jewish law and history, and the accompanying Jewish law is significant. Intrinsically, wine needs to be made with only kosher ingredients. Grapes, of course, are always kosher in their natural state, but as with all kosher law, production is complicated and any findings or additives must be kosher, and in almost all cases, kosher for Passover.
And I'll just comment something I learned actually when you study the Mishnah from Pesachim, the Mishnah talking about what goes into the Seder. The word, when it says wine, you would would expect to see the word that they pour a cup of wine, but I think the word actually is they mix a cup of wine. And it was explained to me when we studied this is that in ancient times, wine was made in a concentrate, or or maybe, you know, Manischewitz, it's hard to imagine it more concentrated, but maybe they would just routinely dilute it. But anyway, I found that interesting. Erwin, you have your hand up.
I was going to, just to fill in what you said, and he's muted. One thing that about that is that all ancient wine was stored in a concentrated form.
Okay,
The
that makes sense.
Greeks and the Romans stored it that way, and this may horrify people, but you preserved it by pouring a layer of olive oil on top.
Actually, it makes sense because it would seal out the air. Erwin.
Yeah, I really don't. I can't believe that everybody I think it's in Oxnard, the Herzog Winery, every person there, Shomer Shabbat.
Yeah. Oh, well.
I appreciate your sharing your disbelief. I suspect, well, you'll see there's a way to get around that rule in a moment, but I know that they serve, you know, wine, and we're going to discover what the word mevushal means. I know they serve wine that is not mevushal, and it's certified kosher, so I would believe that they are all Shomer Shabbat. So
Okay.
So let's
Now I
see.
can rest easy.
Yep. So here's some wine. This wine says mevushal, and this wine says lo mevushal. And the bottle of wine that Cheryl has is Manischewitz, and it says mevushal. And as we were discussing, mevushal means cooked. I have never seen it translated on a bottle of wine. I think people would be sort of horrified if they read that the wine was cooked. Okay, so now the next section is what is mevushal?
Question?
Hold on, Alan. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I mean, you say cooked, fermented. I'm trying to understand how, I mean, I know kind of how wine gets from being grapes, but is the word cooked kind of implied in the production?
No.
It's
So
not.
let's read about mevushal for a moment.
Okay, all right.
Picking up a bottle of kosher wine, you might notice the term mevushal or non-mevushal branded next to the kosher symbol. Occasionally, you'll see neither and must assume the wine was as non-mevushal. Translated literally, mevushal means cooked. In reality, and in most situations, this now means that the wine undergoes flash pasteurization or flash dante, whereby the grape must, the destemmed and crushed product is heated for a short period of time to a high temperature.
Okay, let's stop for a second because there's a couple of words. I have no idea what dente, flash, detent. Anybody know what that means? Okay. And then it says where the grape must. I think must is not a verb here. I think it's a
Does anybody
it's
speak
a term
French?
of art that says the destemmed or crushed product.
Does anyone speak French? Is that détente?
That's what I thought. Yeah, let me look it up.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know.
Think it's
I
détente.
Look where the
I
accent
get
mark
the
is.
relaxation of strained relations, especially political ones through verbal communication. It's talking about diplomacy and the end of the Cold War.
Yes.
Well, that's
So,
not the
no
only
sense
meaning of the
context.
word, Stephen.
yes. So I would do it. You could do. I would do
Okay,
a search.
here we go. It means relaxation.
It means what?
Relaxation.
I would do a search on flash détente, or I would go in the next room and ask Sonia, but that's I don't want to disturb her. Okay, let's continue.
I was looking it up and I got lost myself here. Where was I?
Okay, we're right here, the mevushal process.
The mevushal process allows the wine to be handled by anyone. Otherwise, from when the grapes are first crushed until when the wine is bottled and sealed. Non-mevushal wine may only be touched by Sabbath-observant Jews to be considered kosher. Separately but equally, a bottle of non-mevushal wine may only be opened and poured by a Sabbath-observant Jew as well. The mevushal process allows the wine to be handled freely by anyone, a condition that greatly simplifies wine usage commercially in restaurants or at events such as bar mitzvahs and weddings. Thus, the need for mevushal wine in America is prevalent. In the past several decades, the process for mevushal has been transferred by some practitioners so that the wine could be indistinguishable at times from wines that remain non-mevushal. In fact, some Mevushal wines have been shown to age for many years.
Yeah, no, I know absolutely nothing about wine, how it tastes. I am not a wine maven in the slightest. So so this flash heating or flash pasteurization, you would think that would have an effect on the wine quality or wine taste, but
I think it depends on when you do it. If you do it when it's still grape juice,
yeah,
okay,
I don't,
and then you introduce the microorganisms, then they would breed within the grape juice, and you could put in your own strain, your own culture.
people that I
And
know that are wine mavens look down on kosher wine. The fact that this article, I think, is written by a kosher wine selling company, makes you take it, with a grain of grapes. Jerry,
well,
you
I
know much about?
understand it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Jerry Kirschman, do you know?
Well, I mean, you're recording this, so I don't want anyone to
Okay.
sue me saying that the wine's bad, but
Yeah.
I'll give you more of an opinion when you're not recording it sometime.
Okay. I can put
So
actually.
Cheryl and I just put things we found on the internet that relate
Yeah.
to this, but it has to do with temperature, and maybe that has to do with the
Okay.
mindset of
Okay.
halakha. Yeah.
So I'm going to call first on Jerry Wissett and then Lois.
I've been to many wineries, and I had the, I'd say, unfortunate experience of going to one in Israel that was a kosher winery, of course. It was disgusting. Wineries I've been to in
So hold on a second. Are you saying the state of the winery was disgusting, or the wine
Yes,
was
the
disgusting?
whole place. It was, I've never seen anything like that because
When
I've been
was that?
to
Around what
in-
year?
I would, let me think, about 25 years ago.
Well,
And
today's
my
wine
and then
is
my question is,
yeah.
in what way was it disgusting?
It was dirty.
Okay, so sort of sanitary.
Right.
Yeah.
And the ones that I've been to in California have all been so pristine. So I was in shock, especially because this is supposed to have been manufactured by our people, and I was horrified.
Okay. Have you ever been to a gefilte fish?
No, and I will not.
Now, that's what I would like to go to.
Now you're really going low.
My grandmother made her own.
Oh, we
And
ought to
she'd
do.
go
I
down
don't.
to
I don't
the
want to talk.
fish
No talking about gefilte fish. Except I'm making a note to myself that I ought to do a program on that. Lois.
Okay, so it used to be that Mevushal was this high heat, which most people felt destroyed the fine taste of wine.
Mm-hmm.
And that one of the reasons that traditional kosher wine is so sweet was to cover that up.
Mm.
And what happened fairly recently is this, what they're calling flash détente, was discovered that they could do this very quick heating, and almost all wine mavens now believe that you can have any kosher wine that's just as good as any other wine.
Right,
It's
with
quite
some notable
accepted.
exceptions.
Well, I'm not saying if, what I make a charoset with is still old-fashioned Manischewitz or
Right.
Carmel, and that's what it always was. But
Okay.
you can get really fine kosher wines now
Yeah.
because of this new method. So I don't know who this winemaker is or whether they're blowing smoke. I don't think so. It's
Well-
pretty well accepted now by people in the wine world.
Well, look, I mean, nobody's eating all these kosher foods for the, for the deliciousness of it. It's about it's about what you're supposed to do. And so if you're giving up a little bit of flavor in some of the food or the wine because you believe that
and
this is what you should do,
kosher
then
meat
that's
needs
trade-off.
to be salted and cooked well done.
But
So
Jerry,
what's a fine wine that goes with well done
anyway, as I
steak?
was going to say,
Hold on a second. Jerry
patient.
Wissett is next. Go ahead, Jerry.
No,
About
Jerry's
using
already
hands?
Oh,
spoken.
she already went.
I
then. Sorry.
thought I had the
Sorry.
floor.
Yeah,
Jerry,
go ahead, Lois.
I challenge you. Next time we're physically together, I'm going to be in Oxnard for a month, we will buy a couple bottles of each and taste and see if we can tell the difference.
All right. Well, next
Okay.
time I'm out on the West Coast, I'll give it a shot. But
Oh,
you know,
okay.
I just say this, that the flashing is similar to the like the ultra pasteurization, you know, with that, you know, the long shelf life milk, right? It's the
I don't
same, it's
know
the
if
same
it's the
technique.
same. I don't know enough
Yeah,
to
no,
know.
no, it is. It wasn't a question, it's a statement. It's the same process. You're trying to do as little damage as possible by bringing up very rapidly and cooling it very quickly as well. Now, you know, but like anything else, you know, I think somebody mentioned, look, you can have good wines or bad wines,
Right.
you
Yeah, the
know,
article
but
mentioned.
the storage, when it comes to wine, storage is everything,
Okay,
right?
I don't want to get into wine
Well, but give me 30 seconds because I've listened to a
Okay.
lot of stuff about this.
Okay,
All right.
okay.
So all right. So storage has nothing to do with making. I'm talking about storage after you get the wine, when you bring it
Ah.
home. Okay. I'm not talking about their storage, I'm talking about your storage. So,
Yes.
you know, if it gets hot, you can damage the wine. You know,
Mhm.
cool is usually fine, but if it gets too hot, you know, for example, there's a lot of problems when people store wine in places like Miami and other things like that. If they don't have the proper cooling, the wine is destroyed. So, you know, cardinal rule is heating is bad at any given time in the process, but especially during storage. That's all.
Okay. The other thing I want to mention, Bryce, do you want to add something? I don't know where Bryce went. Okay, Bryce comes in and out. So the other thing I wanted to mention, which this article didn't cover, was why it has to be flash heated or handled by Jews. And my understanding, and so I'm very certain, I'm pretty certain I'm correct, is the issue is whether the wine might have been used in idol worship. And if the wine is only handled by Jews when it's open, then you can be pretty sure it wasn't Sabbath observant Jews. You can be pretty sure it wasn't used in idol worship. What I have no idea is, and I probably should have researched this, is why heating the wine in any way removes I'll just say the stigma of idol worship, or maybe people who worship idols with wine won't use heated wine. And that
I
one,
got two responses to that.
are
The
any of
first
them
one is
serious?
what?
Are any of your responses serious?
Yes, one
Okay,
of them is,
good.
not both of them.
Okay.
The one that is not serious is maybe the issue. It's not idol worship. It's people worship the bacteria or the yeast in the wine.
Okay, let's
and
move to the
cooking it
second one.
kills that off. The one that is serious is that, and this one comes from the Kavod website. I don't know if it's true. The temple worship with the sacrifices, they used uncooked wine as part of it. So therefore, uncooked wine, because it's used in sacrifices, was held to a higher standard.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, maybe I truly don't have the foggiest idea. But one of the reasons, well, anyway, so I will state and maybe get into trouble because I'm stating it on the record here. As a rabbi, I don't insist, for example, at my Jewish weddings, that the wine be kosher. I used to, and a lot of the couples want to have kosher wine. But my own opinion is that the rules for a kosher wine are among the silliest of all kashrut. Sandra, we haven't heard from you.
Yeah, I think that the reason for the wine having to be handled by Jews is more sociological or psychological, the feeling that the other is unclean.
Yeah, but it doesn't apply to chicken, steak, vegetables. Only wine falls into that category. So, and my understanding is, again, the issue is why anything that might have been used but as idol worship or
But we don't make the same kind of prayer, I think, to God. Maybe wine is considered more holy.
No. I mean, so we make exactly the same kind of prayer. We don't say pray priya gafen. We say hamotzi lechem min haaretz, and so on.
So it's not that it's more holy, and that
the only thing that this reminds me of is there is a prohibition that applies to hair and maybe other things as well.
Uh-huh.
So as you probably know, in the Ashkenazi tradition, married women cover their hair.
Yeah.
And one way they can cover it is with wigs.
Mm-hmm.
And a few years ago, I mean, a lot of the wigs came from India and places where women would sell their hair.
Mm-hmm.
And the rabbis ruled, I think this is an example of, getting more and more ultra. The rabbis ruled that since in India, you have a basic, the largest religion in India is Hinduism, which is idol worship, that this hair was on the head of idol worshippers, and therefore it could not be used by Orthodox women to cover their hair. And the sad thing is, they ruled that they couldn't even sell it to someone, because wigs are quite expensive, human hair wigs, or even give it away to cancer patients that would want to have, even non-Jewish cancer patients, because you can't benefit from something that was used in idol worship. And I think the wine is that same idea.
Could be.
Jerry.
Yeah, just right on that topic. I'm just wondering, go back to the Talmud, try to find there, and I'm wondering, like cleansing of the utensils with fire could this be like? But why wine different than other things?
Yeah. And again, my understanding, and it'd be worth checking, but my understanding was the ritual use of wine by other cultures, also in their idol worship, presumably.
But they also use animals so how do you separate? So then the question is, what's different then to separate that out? How does wine stand apart from those other things?
Well, if they use an animal, the animal by definition wouldn't be kosher, because it wouldn't be slaughtered in a kosher way. So there's no issue about whether that animal would be kosher.
Well, a Jew could slaughter and then a Gentile use it in idol worship or whatever.
Yes, that's theoretically possible.
Yeah,
but not in temple times. So anyway, it's a good question. Yeah. I think because wine was so associated with ritual that this restriction came. I actually don't think this article gets into that. I could be wrong. I read the article like a week ago.
Okay, well, I was just thinking that, how when you pass the utensils through fire or heat, maybe this is the same. Maybe they're drawing it from that. It could be.
But they're not saying it goes from being kosher to unkosher. Well, I guess they are. They're saying if the wine is going to be handled by non-Jews, heating it is the solution. But that, okay, it's the same kind of process. It's a very good point, Alan.
So a lot of foods are prepared with people, but the two blessings which I learned and really like is that the blessings over wine and over bread are us for how we learn that this is a partnership between God and humans, that we're not saying the blessing over the wheat or over the grapes, we're saying it over the wine. And I don't know if that's relevant to this kosher wine thing, but it occurs to me to mention that point.
I think what you're talking about is an insight into the nature of blessings. If you were eating grapes, you would say a blessing over the grapes. It might not be B'rei Pri Hagafen. It might be another blessing. But basically, anything you eat requires a blessing.
Okay, thanks.
Because ultimately, it's all from God. Okay, I think we're up to here. Joanne still.
Okay, still most premium wines are made non-mevshal, as many winemakers want total control of their wines and as little outside influence as possible on their products.
So we're going to read some more interesting stuff. But so my understanding is the wine from the crushing of the grapes to the bottling has to be by Sabbath observant Jews. And I think it can, as long as it's sealed, it can be handled like in a truck by anyone. But then once you open the bottle and it's going to be poured, the waiters at the restaurant have to be Sabbath observant Jews, which I think is, one of the reasons why Erwin is wondering whether that's really true. But that's the rule, unless it's mevushal. If it's mevushal, anybody can pour it. So let's go on. What can invalidate a wine's kosher status?
With the Sabbath observant person handling the production from crush to bottling in place, What is left for wine to be considered kosher is the intrinsic kosher ingredients, including the yeast and fining agents, as well as cleaning products used in the process of winemaking. Fining agents are used by some winemakers to remove colloids or unwanted aspects of a wine, including clarification for color, aroma, or bitterness, as well as to stabilize the product. These agents bind to the unwanted component and can then be filtered out. Traditionally, these agents have included dried blood powder, but today more typically include two categories of agents: organic compounds from animals and solid or mineral materials.
Okay,
Or,
organic compounds.
include egg whites, isinglass from a fish bladder, gelatin from the animal, collagen, casein derived from milk. Solid mineral materials include pulverized bentonite, clay, activated charcoal carbon, and potassium ferrocyanide.
Oh,
Boy, it really sounds good, huh?
yeah.
In kosher winemaking, ruling out complicated agents of isinglass, gelatin, and casein, as it is dairy, the most commonly used agent is bentonite. Though egg whites may be and occasionally are used in smaller productions outside the US, though egg whites would render a wine problematic for vegans. Many winemakers prefer not to fine their wines, worried about losing important compounds for aroma and flavor. Additionally, the rising demand for vegan and kosher products has played a role in which fining agents, if any, are used. And last, as popularity for natural winemaking increases, winemakers seek the most natural finished product and frown upon fining agents.
I'm just remembering something I hadn't thought of in decades. Our neighbor across the street where I grew up was an Italian guy, and he made his own wine, and it was strong. I have no idea what additives he might have added, but it was strong. So here's an illustration of these elements and which ones would not be, I guess, acceptable for kosher wine. So isinglass, I presume if it was a kosher fish, it would be okay, but I don't know what kind of fish they use. Gelatin, because it's often made from a well, it's made from various sides of kinds of
Hoof,
animals.
from the hoof.
It's made from the hoof, and so then the question is, was the gelatin, if it's made from the hoof of a cow, was the cow slaughtered in a kosher way? And so that would become an issue. And casein is a dairy product, so that would render the wine dairy, not parve, so it couldn't be served with meat.
I would like to ask Jerry a question.
Go ahead.
Jerry, can you hear me?
Which Jerry?
Yeah.
Okay, my question is that why European wines for so many years from his, let's say from the Rothschild winery, so good, and they never used any of these products, and they stored the wine in specific drums, and the drums were cleaned with sulfur, and they rinsed, and you know how many years they were using the same drums, and they didn't have to use flash heating or flash cooling. And so these are my questions, and they were
The simple answer, it's called terroir. It's the ground, right? So the wine absorbs what the soil that it's in, and it's the soil, and that's why it's got that great flavor, and that property is worth a lot because of that soil.
Yeah, and champagne technically can only come from wines that are grown in that.
Yeah, but for example, when Pasteur discovered the bacteria, because that's what he was hired for, to prevent the wine to becoming bad, and he found the bacteria which causes that. And so after that, the European winemakers solved the problem, and the wine
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, it's just simply where it comes from. I mean,
for
you know, the
long
flavor
period of
comes from the soil and you know how it's handled, but it's mostly that.
But when the Rothschilds studied,
Erwin, we're not going to get a more detailed answer. So,
okay,
sorry.
Yeah.
all right.
Okay, so now the question is kosher wine halal? Halal is the Muslim dietary restriction.
The similarities between Jewish dietary restrictions, kosher, and Islamic dietary restrictions, halal, are many, but still there are major differences. As the scope of this review is kosher wine, we will discuss just that. With much of what is already kosher would normally also be considered halal, this does not extend to kosher wine. This halal prohibition is not specific to just wine of any kind, but to the consumption of any alcoholic beverage in any form. So it is not that kosher wine is not halal, but that no alcohol is halal.
Yeah, and halal is interesting. One of the requirements of halal is that the animal must be slaughtered in the name of God, acknowledging God. So all kosher meats are also halal, but the reverse is not true. There, I think horse meat is halal, but it's not kosher.
Kosher wine from Israel. Archaeological digs throughout the land of Israel prove that far from being a new wine region in the world, Israel and the Eastern Mediterranean region is likely the oldest clocking in at 5,000 years. Following the Islamic conquest and Turkish rule, alcohol was banned in the Holy Land, but was revived in the 19th century with the aid of Baron Edmund
The Rothschild.
The Rothschild of the famed Chateau Lafite Rothschild, who brought world-class winemaking techniques back to Israel. Following the birth of the modern state of Israel in 1948, wine production increased in the coastal areas, but was still made primarily for religious use. In the 1970s and 1980s, the Golan Heights, with its high altitude and cooler climate, became the premier terroir in Israeli winemaking.
Yeah, and I'll mention, God, what was I going to say? I forgot. Oh, you know, I have an interest in archaeology, and in recent years, there's a sort of a subdiscipline of archaeology relating to foods, and they have discovered wine casks, really ancient wine casks, and obviously what's in them are not liquid, but there's residue, and they can find out a lot about the nature of ancient wines from that.
So there were wines around the biblical, not necessarily biblical, around the time of Jesus. Is some of that I've read came from that period. Yeah.
Yeah, and there are stories in the New Testament about, you know, turning the wine into water and water into wine. Sorry, the other way. And of course in the Mishnah, you know, it talks about the 4 cups of wine and in the Seder, and I think some of the sacrifices are accompanied by wine. Again, I don't pay a tremendous amount of attention to that. If the temple is rebuilt, I'll have to brush up. Okay, Joanne, you want to continue? You're doing a great job. So while
Israel is still considered a newly emerging viticultural area and many of its wineries are in their infancy, the coupling of internationally trained winemakers with the latest farming technologies are birthing wines receiving worldwide recognition. Recent years have seen the reemergence of grape varieties native to Israel, such as Marawi, Bituni, and Aragman. And while classic Bordeaux varieties can fare well and are popular in this climate, Mediterranean origin grapes such as Marselan and Carignan produce beautiful wines in the similarly warm climate. Israel now boasts over 300 wineries from its 6 main wine regions: Golan, Upper and Lower Golan, Northern Israel; Galilee, Upper Galilee East, Upper Galilee West, and Lower Galilee, Northern Israel; Coastal Plains, Zichron, Yaakov,
I would
Hanadi,
just read the titles.
Okay,
Central.
Coastal Plains, Central Mountain, Judea, and Negev. A common misperception is that all wine from Israel is kosher. While the overwhelming majority of wine exported from Israel to the American market is indeed kosher, over 90%, and the overwhelming majority of exported Israeli wines are to America, many Israel wines are not made with kosher supervision. Kosher wine made inside Israel is also assigned to follow additional laws, many of them biblical agricultural laws. Some of these biblical laws are today used in international viticulture, not for religious reasons, but for the betterment of the vineyards. Jewish agricultural laws include Orlah. Orlah refers to the biblical prohibition against eating fruits of a tree during the first 3 years after planting. These fruits are to be left alone, as one may not receive any benefit from them. This prohibition is one of the few biblical agricultural prohibitions that even applies to fruits grown outside Israel, though they are
Leniencies.
leniencies, right?
Yeah, and I'll just mention that there are many of the 613 commandments that only apply inside Israel. And I think we're going to see some more of them right here. Terumot and Ma'aserot.
There is a mandate to separate terumah and masar from Israeli produce. In the Jewish temple era, these separated portions were given to members of the priestly tribe, Levites, and to the poor or eaten in Jerusalem. Although we no longer eat these portions in Jerusalem, these portions are still designated, and even fruits grown in Israel may not be eaten in the diaspora unless these portions were taken.
Yeah.
Shemitah, every 7 years in Israel, the land is to have a sabbatical year and to lie fallow and rest. All agricultural activity is forbidden. The next Shemitah year in Israel is the Jewish year of 5782, or 2021 to 2022. There are some methods with which produce from Shemitah years may be sold and consumed.
And that's kind of an interesting one. If the rabbis declare an emergency, then you can sell your land and maybe even lease your land to a non-Jew, because if the crops are grown on non-Jewish owned land, then they're not subject to Shemitah. And the cleverest version of this, I once saw advertised, I think in the Jerusalem Post International Edition, which would allow us in the US to fulfill the mitzvah of Shemitah. They were basically, for some relatively small amount of money, $30, $40, maybe $18, would basically set aside 1 square inch of land in Israel for the Shemitah year and do nothing with it. And so that would allow you, as the the lessee of that land, to fulfill the mitzvah of Shemitah. I thought that was pretty clever. Okay, I think we're almost done with this article, so let's see if we can press on and finish.
Kilai HaKarem. In Israel, it is biblically prohibited to plant another crop species within and between a vineyard's vines. This is an uncommon practice in any regard nowadays. Where to buy kosher wine? The kosher wine world is growing by leaps and bounds annually, as today over 4,000 individual labels of kosher wine brands are produced. Quite the hop, skip, and jump from the relatively few kosher wines produced just 2 generations ago. Kosher wine is being produced in many of the top wine regions all over the world, allowing the strictly kosher consumer to enjoy the greatest the world has to offer. In fact, otherwise non-kosher wineries in many famous regions, including Bordeaux in France, Tuscany in Italy, and the Finger Lakes in America, and many others now commonly make kosher runs of their wines as they see the value in increasing their customer base and brand. Most wine styles and varieties are today represented among kosher wine brands, and the availability and growth of this market is booming. The future is here. Internet commerce allows us to shop for the wine of our choice and have it delivered to our doorstep in short order. The vast array of kosher wines available to the consumer are very tough to find in many American local markets. Online wine buying from sites such as kosherwine.com allows those in even remote areas the opportunity to taste much of what the kosher wine world has to offer. The future of kosher wine, if current trends continue, the market for anything and everything kosher will continue to grow exponentially, and not just for the kosher keeping individuals. Kosher is now a huge industry representing the big business of world-leading brands and iconic items. And kosher symbols are sought after those seeking items that are healthier, adhere to guidelines that dictate ingredients safe for those with allergies, lactose intolerance, and other dietary restrictions, such as halal, or those seeking strictly vegetarian or vegan diet items. The point is that the kosher can be trusted without deeper research because of the extra levels of supervision and oversight, and because of truth in labeling. Kosher wine continues to abandon its image as thickly sweet sacramental wines. We still have those for those who seek them, and further delineate into wines which just happen to be kosher. Kosher wines are now being made in much of the wine producing world, with even an ever-growing portfolio of varieties and styles. Kosher wine is available at all price levels and is available in many cities and via the internet for most consumers. As interest continues to grow, the future for kosher wine could not be brighter.
Yeah, I think the last couple of lines there are really an advertisement. So I will apologize a little bit for that. Alan.
Well, anything kosher that equates to healthful always seems to strike me as in contradiction.
Yeah, I
because
mean,
the premise is that it's not about. I agree. I think you made the statement I'm really making, that those sentences, don't seem to jive with. I mean, they're not dishonest, but they just don't.
Well, I think what they're referring to is additives, but presumably kosher additives could be used. And then for people who are dairy intolerant, if you if it's not dairy, then I think you can be very sure that if you're a lactose intolerant, you can drink that wine. And I guess there are some agents sometimes that are used in wine that are made from milk. But yeah, I agree with you. I always say the one word proof that kosher is not equivalent to health is schmaltz, which is chicken fat. Okay, any other comments before we stop the recording and we can hear what you really think of kosher wines? Okay, so I am going to stop the recording.